Nobody expected Putin to say yes. For months, Ukraine had been pushing for a ceasefire, a real one, 30 days, unconditional, the kind that could actually mean something. Russia said no every single time. And then, out of nowhere, Putin agreed to a truce. Not 30 days, 32 hours. Timed perfectly for Orthodox Easter. Framed as a humanitarian gesture. A sign, the Kremlin said, that Russia wants peace. And the world watched. Some called it a breakthrough. Some called it a signal. Ukraine called it something else entirely. A trap. Now here's what makes this story so much more interesting than it looks on the surface. Because this is not really about Easter. It's not even about a ceasefire. It's about a pattern. A very specific, very deliberate pattern that has played out before, almost beat for beat. And once you understand it, this announcement looks completely different. This story has three layers. The first is about what Putin actually announced, and what the Kremlin very carefully didn't say. The second is about why Ukraine's response wasn't emotional or angry. It was cold, analytical, and grounded entirely in what happened last year. The third is about what this moment tells us about where this war actually stands right now, and why both sides are playing for something much larger than 32 hours of silence. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Do you think this truce is real, or is it theater? We read every single one. Now let's get into it. Here is what Putin actually announced. On April 9th, the Kremlin published a formal decree. Russian forces would observe a ceasefire starting at 4 p.m. on April 11th and running through the end of the day on April 12th, Orthodox Easter Sunday, 32 hours. Described as a decision made in connection with the approaching Orthodox feast of Easter, the General Staff was ordered to halt combat operations across all directions for the duration of the truce. That sounds straightforward, almost generous. But buried inside that same announcement was a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about how Moscow actually views this. The Kremlin said Russian troops must remain ready to counter any possible provocations by the enemy, as well as any aggressive actions. Read that again slowly. You are announcing a ceasefire, and in the same breath, you are telling your troops to stay combat ready for enemy provocations. That is not the language of peace. That is the language of a setup. Because if fighting resumes, for any reason, from any direction, under any circumstances, Russia has already pre-written its explanation. Ukraine provoked us. We were ready. We responded. And here's the second thing the announcement didn't include. No verification mechanism. No international monitors. No formal communication to Kyiv through any diplomatic back channel before going public. Ukraine's President Zelensky found out the same way everyone else did. It appeared on the Kremlin's website. Now think about that for a moment. If you are genuinely offering a ceasefire, especially one framed as a goodwill gesture, you don't announce it publicly first. You communicate through back channels. You give the other side time to stand down, to pull units back, to coordinate on the ground. That's how real ceasefires are structured. What Putin did was the opposite. He announced it publicly, framed it as generosity, and placed Ukraine in an impossible position. Either accept immediately and look like you're following Russia's lead, or push back and look like the side that rejected peace on Easter. It's a communications play as much as a military one. Zelensky saw it immediately. His response was precise and deliberate. He did not reject the truce outright. He said Ukraine will act accordingly, but he immediately called for something Russia has refused to agree to for over a year, extend it to 30 days. His exact framing was pointed. He said 32 hours is enough to make headlines, but not enough for genuine confidence building. 30 days, he said, could give peace a real chance. In my view, that response was strategically brilliant. By calling for an extension, Zelensky didn't look like he was rejecting peace. He looked like he wanted more of it. And he immediately put the burden back on Moscow. Because if Russia refuses to extend a ceasefire, it just publicly called a humanitarian gesture. That tells you exactly how humanitarian it really is. But here's the part of this story that most coverage is missing entirely. This is not new. We have seen this exact sequence before, and what happened last time is the key to understanding what is likely to happen now. Here's the part that should make you stop and think, because what is happening this week is not new. It has happened before, almost word for word, almost move for move. Last Easter, April 2025, Putin did the exact same thing. He announced a unilateral 30-hour ceasefire, framed it as humanitarian, timed it for the holiday, called on Ukraine to follow Russia's example, used almost identical language. And what happened? Within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, air raid sirens went off across Ukraine. Kyiv residents reported explosions shortly after the truce began. By the end of that 30-hour window, Ukraine had counted nearly 2,000 instances of Russian shelling along the front line, including over 800 incidents involving heavy weaponry. The total violation count, depending on the source and how violations were measured, ran into the thousands on both sides. Ukraine said Russia broke the truce nearly 3,000 times. Russia said Ukraine broke it over 4,000 times. Both sides blamed each other. The fighting never fully stopped. And yet, here is the detail that is almost never discussed. Something did change during those 30 hours. Long-range missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian cities dropped significantly. There were no major air raids. No Shahed drone swarms over Kyiv overnight. For one day, Ukrainian civilians were not woken by the sound of air raid sirens at 3 in the morning. So, was the Easter 2025 truce a complete lie? Not exactly. But was it a genuine ceasefire? Absolutely not. What it was, and this is my read of the situation, was a carefully calibrated partial pause. Enough silence in the right places to generate positive headlines and footage of Putin crossing himself at a church service. Just enough continued pressure on the front line to maintain military momentum and use the pause, as Ukraine's 66th Brigade publicly documented, to reposition troops and clear infrastructure that had been blocking Russian movement. Ukraine's 66th Mechanized Brigade stationed near Lyman reported that during the 2025 Easter truce, Russian forces used the pause to clear a destroyed piece of equipment that had been blocking a critical river crossing. The moment the ceasefire ended, a massive infantry offensive launched from positions that had been quietly prepared while the cameras were focused on Easter candles. That is not a ceasefire. That is a reload. And here is what makes this year's announcement so important to read carefully. Because the language from the Kremlin in 2026 is nearly identical to 2025. The same framing, the same humanitarian justification, the same instruction to troops to remain ready to counter enemy provocations, the same public announcement without prior diplomatic coordination. Pattern recognition is one of the most underrated tools in geopolitical analysis. When a government repeats the same playbook, in the same sequence, with the same language, it is not a coincidence. It is a strategy that worked the first time. And the question worth asking right now is, what exactly did that strategy achieve in 2025 that Moscow might be trying to replicate in 2026? The answer has almost nothing to do with Easter. It has everything to do with Washington. Here is what was happening in the days before Putin announced the 2025 Easter truce. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had just said publicly that the United States was running out of patience with both Russia and Ukraine and might walk away from the mediation process entirely. President Trump echoed that frustration the same day. The message from Washington was unmistakable. Show us progress, or we walk. Within 24 hours of that warning, Putin announced the Easter ceasefire. Think about the timing. Really think about it. An administration threatening to disengage suddenly gets a headline. Putin declares truce. The pressure to walk away evaporates overnight. The story shifts from talks collapsing to breakthrough possible. And Russia has bought itself more time without making a single substantive concession. Now look at where things stand in April 2026. U.S.-led peace talks have been frozen since February after the Iran conflict pulled Washington's attention away. 3 rounds of negotiations, in Jeddah, Geneva, and Abu Dhabi, produced no breakthrough on any core issue. Russia's position on territory has not moved. Ukraine's position on sovereignty has not moved. And Trump is facing mounting domestic pressure to show results on Ukraine after promising he would end the war within 24 hours of taking office. The conditions in April 2026 are almost identical to the conditions in April 2025. A frustrated American president, stalled negotiations, a ceasefire announcement timed perfectly to reset the diplomatic narrative without requiring Russia to give up anything real. In my view, that timing is not accidental. It never is. So if the Easter truce is largely a communications play, who is the actual audience? Because it is not Ukraine. Kyiv knows this playbook better than anyone. Ukraine agreed to a full 30-day ceasefire proposed by the United States back in March. Russia rejected it. Ukraine agreed to stop targeting energy infrastructure. Russia accused Ukraine of violating that agreement over 100 times, while making the same accusation against Kyiv to justify its own continued strikes. Ukraine has been on record accepting unconditional ceasefires, while Russia has consistently responded with conditions, delays, and maximum demands that Zelensky has repeatedly described as tantamount to capitulation. So the audience for the Easter truce announcement is not Kyiv, it is Washington. And beyond Washington, the world. Here is why that matters enormously right now. The Trump administration has structured its entire Ukraine peace effort around a core bargain. Ukraine cedes more territory in the Donbass, and in return gets security guarantees from the West. That framework has not worked. Russia has not accepted it. Ukraine has resisted it. and 3 rounds of US-led talks have ended without a single breakthrough on the central issues. At the same time, US attention has genuinely shifted. The Iran conflict, the situation in the Middle East, the pressure of domestic politics. Ukraine is no longer the top foreign policy priority in the way it was even 6 months ago. Russian support among the Russian public for continuing the war has been dropping. According to the independent Levada Center, by December 2025, only 25% of Russians supported continuing the war, while 66% favored moving toward negotiations. Russia's war economy is under pressure. Oil sanctions have hit revenue. Regional budgets across Russia are running deficits to fund recruitment bonuses for soldiers. The cost of the war is no longer invisible to ordinary Russians. And yet the Kremlin has not moved on its core demands. It still insists Ukraine cannot join NATO. It still demands territorial concessions on land it does not fully control. It still refuses international monitoring of any ceasefire. What that tells you is that while Russia feels economic pressure, the Kremlin does not yet feel enough pressure to make a real concession. Instead, it is managing perceptions, generating goodwill moments, a ceasefire for Easter, a prisoner exchange, a statement about peace, while maintaining the military strategy underneath. And the prisoner exchange is worth pausing on, because it happened at the same time as the truce. Russia and Ukraine exchanged hundreds of POWs this week, mediated by the United Arab Emirates. It was genuinely significant. Real people came home. But notice what the Kremlin did with it. It packaged the prisoner exchange and the Easter truce into the same news cycle. So the story became, Russia announces ceasefire and frees prisoners. That is a very different headline than, Russia announces a ceasefire it will probably not fully observe. Information framing is a weapon, and Moscow uses it with considerable sophistication. Now here is the dimension of this story that almost no mainstream outlet is connecting right now. The Easter truce of 2026 is happening against the backdrop of something much bigger than the Ukraine front line. It is happening while US-mediated peace talks are frozen, while Washington is distracted by the Middle East, while Europe is trying to build its own security architecture for Ukraine, independent of American guarantees, and while Russia is firing more drones at Ukraine than in any previous month of the war. March 2026 saw the highest volume of Russian drone attacks on Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Over 1,000 drones and missiles were launched in a single month. Ukrainian civilians were killed. A serviceman and his teenage daughter were killed in a strike on western Ukraine. And then, into that context, Putin announces an Easter truce. The contrast is deliberate. The escalation just before the pause makes the pause look more dramatic by comparison. And the pause, however partial, resets the diplomatic clock. This is the pattern. Escalate, then pause. Generate a humanitarian gesture. Let the cameras capture the church service. Let the diplomats breathe a cautious sigh of relief. And then, the moment the window closes, resume. In 2025, Putin explicitly confirmed this. On the Monday after Easter, he stated publicly that combat operations had resumed. Not paused pending further talks. Resumed. Immediately. The question for 2026 is whether this cycle produces a different result, or whether it simply repeats itself at higher cost to everyone involved. And that question brings us to the piece of this story that nobody is saying out loud. Ukraine is not in the same position it was a year ago, and that changes the calculus in ways that are not obvious from the outside. Here is what the Easter truce story is really about when you strip away the headlines. It is about what happens to a war when neither side can win quickly, but neither side is willing to lose anything real to end it. That is where Russia and Ukraine are right now, and it is the hardest place in any conflict to navigate. Russia controls roughly 83% of the territory it claimed to annex in 2022. Ukrainian forces retook about 100 square miles in the Zaporizhia region earlier this year, but Russia holds the majority of the Donbass and shows no sign of withdrawing from any of it. At the same time, Russia's pace of advance has slowed significantly compared to a year ago. The Institute for the Study of War estimates Russian forces moved at roughly half the rate in early 2026 compared to the same period in 2025. Ukraine faces real manpower pressures, but it has dramatically scaled up its medium-range drone capability, striking Russian air defense systems and command infrastructure deep inside Russian territory in ways that were not possible 12 months ago. Neither side is winning. Neither side is collapsing. And both sides are watching Washington for signals about what comes next. That is why this Easter truce matters. Not because 32 hours of partial silence will change the trajectory of the war. It won't. Both sides know it won't. It matters because it is a message to Trump. Russia is saying, we can be reasonable when we want to be. We can generate goodwill. We can make gestures. But we are not going to accept your 30-day ceasefire proposal. And we are not going to give up territory. and we are not going to accept NATO on our border. If you want to stay engaged, those are the terms. Ukraine is saying something different. Zelensky's response, mirror the truce, call for 30 days, let Russia's refusal speak for itself, is a message to the same audience. We have agreed to every ceasefire proposal on the table. We agreed to 30 days. Russia said no. We agreed to energy infrastructure. Russia violated it. We are agreeing to Easter. Watch what Russia does next. Both sides are performing for Washington, and Washington, for the moment, is distracted. The 3 rounds of US-mediated talks, Jeddah, Geneva, Abu Dhabi, have produced no breakthrough on territory, no breakthrough on security guarantees, no breakthrough on NATO. The talks are, by almost every credible assessment, stalled in a way that is structural, not temporary. Russia's negotiating position has not changed. It wants Ukraine to formally cede the Donbass. It wants legal guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. It wants sanctions relief. Ukraine has rejected all 3 as unacceptable. The gap between those positions is not a negotiating gap. It is an existential one. And short-term truces, however choreographed, do not close existential gaps. They just pause them. In my view, what we are watching with the Easter truce of 2026 is the latest iteration of a conflict that has settled into a grinding equilibrium, punctuated by moments of apparent diplomacy that generate headlines without generating progress. That does not mean peace is impossible. It means peace at this moment would require a level of compromise from at least one side that neither side has shown any willingness to make. The Levada Center numbers from Russia are telling. 2/3 of Russians favor negotiations. But public opinion in authoritarian systems does not translate directly into policy change. Putin does not need 66% approval to continue the war. He needs control of the institutions. And he has it. The European dimension matters here too. The UK and France have been building what they call a coalition of the willing, a framework for deploying multinational forces in Ukraine as part of any post-ceasefire arrangement. Ukraine, France, and the UK signed a trilateral declaration in Paris in January 2026, covering ceasefire monitoring, long-term military support, and multinational force deployment. But that framework only activates after a ceasefire, and a ceasefire requires Russia's agreement, which Russia has not given, to any proposal that does not include major Ukrainian concessions. So where does this leave the Easter truce of April 2026? Exactly where the Easter truce of April 2025 left things. A brief, partial, heavily disputed pause in a conflict that has no clear off-ramp. A diplomatic gesture designed more for external audiences than for any military purpose. A moment that will be remembered, if it is remembered at all, as one more data point in a long pattern of ceasefires that came and went without changing anything fundamental. Zelensky put it best. 32 hours is enough for headlines, not for peace. What would change the trajectory is not another Easter truce. It is not another round of talks in a European capital. It is a genuine shift in one side's strategic calculus, either Russia concluding that the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of compromising, or Ukraine receiving the kind of sustained, unconditional support that makes Russia's military strategy more expensive than its political one. Neither of those shifts is visible right now, which means the most honest answer to the question this video started with, is this a ceasefire or a trap, is that it is neither, exactly. It is a performance, a well-timed, carefully scripted performance that both sides understand perfectly and are participating in for their own reasons. The war continues, the diplomacy continues, and the gap between those two things is where the real story lives. We will keep watching this space closely as the 32 hours play out. If you found this breakdown useful, share it with someone who wants to understand what is actually happening, not just what the headlines say. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive, and drop your read in the comments. Do you think this truce will hold, break, or get extended? We'll be watching.